Good morning. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to you all. A very warm welcome here from Switzerland and Gland. My name is Mina Epps and I head up IUCN Secretariat work on ocean and the ocean team. So I really wanted to say firstly, thank you for taking the time to joining us here today. We know, taking time out of a busy schedule, and it's overall a very, very busy year for the ocean. Not only are we kind of gearing up to the UN Ocean Conference, the second conference taking place in Lisbon, there's also the Ocean Dialogue happening in Bonn this week. And that's something that we have been working on for a very long time to be engaged. So we're very happy to see the Ocean Dialogue as part of the UNFCCC and the SEPSTA meetings happening. And you've all heard Peter Thomson, the UN Special Envoy for the Ocean, basically saying many times, like, this is the year that we're going to stop the decline of ocean health. And obviously that includes the high seas. And, the BBNJ and the legally binding treaty on this is actually a key pillar in kind of determining not only the future of, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So this is very, very important time. And IUCN has been very involved in both the commentary and also the last text that was released at the end of May. So we're working on that together with our expert from our various commissions. Some of them are here with us today that we'll hear from shortly. And I really think that that is the power of the union, as well as having collaboration with key research institutions and other stakeholders in this space. So again, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us. This webinar, which is taking place today, is actually about connectivity, climate change, and their implication both for designing and establishing area-based management tools, including MPAs, and also environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental impact assessment. So that is really what the webinar is focusing on today. And I think we often hear talking about an international meeting, the nexus between ocean and climate change, but also we need to bring in biodiversity, and connectivity, as we know, is key. So if we're talking about a future-proof, legally binding treaty, it can't be future-proof if it's not climate-proof. So we're going to hear we have a very exciting lineup of speakers and experts that will give a presentation, and there will be opportunity for a Q&A session happening towards the end. And also highlight that this is part of a knowledge series, and that already later this week, we're going to run 2 webinars on marine genetic resources on Thursday and Friday, and you're all invited to join that as well. So I will actually going to be handing over to today's moderator. It's Christina Jade, and she is our Senior High Seas Advisor. And she'll be introducing the panelists and moderating also the Q&A session. And I will actually, before I leave it in, this is really, I will probably end with saying that, this webinar is really to continue the momentum and really to, make sure that we're all here in it together, ready to make history in New York. And I think with those words, I will, hand it over to Christina's capable hands. And enjoy the webinar. Thank you. Christina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you so much, audience, and thank you so much, our expert speakers. It's really exciting to be here to start to dig a little bit deeper into this new President's further revised draft text of the BBNJ agreement, with particular focus, as we said, on area-based management tools, on environmental impact assessments, and strategic environmental assessments, because we have the pressures of connectivity and climate change coming together on top of our heads. Climate change may alter fundamental elements of connectivity that we have come to rely upon. We need climate smart and future-proofed BBNJ agreement, and I can think of no better experts to try to explore some of the implications of climate change and connectivity for the BBNJ agreement than those we have with us today. Let me just introduce these to you, and then we'll go right into the talks, because we'd like to save time for your questions at the end. First, we'll have Dr. Anna Metaxas, who is a professor in the Department of Oceanography at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. Her focus is on the ecology and conservation of benthic ecosystems from shallow water to the deep sea. She is co-lead of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative's Task Force on Biodiversity Conservation and lead author for the Nexus Assessment of the IPBES, the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Next, we'll have Dr. Meinhard Duell, who is a professor of law at the Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University, also from Halifax, Canada, and a member of the Marine Environmental Law Institute. Meinhard has been involved in research and practice of EIAs and SEAs for over 30 years and has been following the elements of EIAs in the BBNJ negotiations. And Dr. Simi Payne is professor in the Law School and Department of Human Ecology at Rutgers University in New Jersey, United States. She is chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, Ocean Law Specialist Group, and participates in the BBNJ process with the IUCN delegation. It is a real pleasure and honor to be working with all of these and to have them with us today. Anna, I think we will head over to you for a discussion on connectivity and climate change.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here, very happy to be able to share some of my thoughts in terms of ecological connections in the high seas. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all the participants. Thank you for joining us. So I will start by showing this picture and reminding everybody that we actually are talking about a global ocean. We may have labeled individual basins, they've given them different names, but at the end of the day, as you can see in these pictures, what we have is a lot of blue that is covering a lot of our planet, and really there's no boundaries across those areas of the ocean. So this is why we're referring to the global ocean rather to the world's oceans with an S. And so in light of that, of course, we know that those connections that happen across the ocean, a lot of it, you know, we all think about how the water moves, and it moves with currents. And here's an example of you know, the picture of surface currents that are driven by winds through the world's oceans, and you can, each one of you can see your favorite current that you can see here, the Gulf Stream, Kuroshio, Agulhas. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, the water will pass through there on its way to a different ocean basin, and therefore produce connections across the entire global ocean. We also think about connections, ecological connections, and although we may not realize it, we actually know about a lot of them that go on. As we live, we all know about turtles that migrate across the ocean to go to lay eggs at their favorite beach. We all know about whales that dive deep into the ocean to feed on their favorite food. In this case, you're seeing the schematic with squid. And so we know of some of those arrows that are indicated here, some of those processes that are indicated by these arrows, and some of them are in the vertical, and some of them are horizontal direction across the ocean versus from the surface to the seabed. In terms of what scientists define as ecological connectivity is really very much about those arrows, the directions of those arrows that I just showed you. So what connectivity does is it describes those linkages, ecological linkages between locations or between habitats from the surface to the deep. And those linkages can be either because individual organisms move or because the resources that they require are move and they're connected through those vertical or horizontal pathways. So connectivity, the importance of connectivity has been rising to the surface quite a bit recently in conservation, to the point where IUCN actually produced the guidelines on how to conserve connectivity, and in this instance is through ecological networks and corridors. So we know it's important. We know it's important to conserve, but why? What is it and why? So what you see here is a cross-section of the ocean, and that red dashed line, it shows you where the deep ocean actually starts. It's about 200 meters depth. And what you see with all those different arrows are different processes that connect different parts of the ocean, one with the atmosphere. We all are familiar, we hear about how the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide and so critical in absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also releases carbon dioxide. And this is this fine balance between the two processes that has us worried about about what will happen into the future. But also you can see here in this lower part of the figure from the sort of shallow component of the oceans where the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, the different plankton live, and how these sink to the deeper parts of the ocean, either because they die or because they're eaten. And then that carbon from the surface layers moves all the way through down and eventually hits the seabed at several kilometers depth, where it maybe bury or provide carbon at that depth for animals that live there. So Christina mentioned the importance of climate change. And of course, climate change is also going to be, we know, is going to impacting some of those arrows, some of those connections. And we know for a fact that the ocean cannot keep absorbing carbon dioxide forever. And so they'll know that those arrows in particular, the carbon uptake and release of CO2 from the surface layer of the ocean are certainly going to be impacted as climate is changing. But we also know that the deeper, those linkages of the surface with the deeper parts of the ocean and the seabed, and those linkages are mostly occurring in areas beyond national jurisdiction, of course, those will change as well. And so there's going to be significant, profound changes in how much carbon sinks through the surface to the seabed, to those the middle parts of the water column at the depths of hundreds to thousands of meters, and it will affect who eats whom, how much decomposes, how much carbon sequesters, and how much gets recycled. So we know those processes are also going to be impacted. Also a little bit about the animals that are moving around, and they're making some of those connections in the water column. Of course, we have animals that are moved, they move themselves. Those are, we have fish and squid, jellyfish, all those animals that we know about. Some of them are looking a little strange, but that's what happens when you live in the deep sea. You become a little strange. But then there's also animals that live attached to the seabed that don't move a lot. And so you see examples of, for example, a sea urchin also live in the deep sea, a sea anemone, and some fish or brittle stars. And so what happens with these animals that don't, because, for example, a sea urchin or anemone cannot move very far, the way movement happens is through their larvae. So these animals release larvae that are very small, they're planktonic, they're really just like zooplankton. They can be a millimeter or less than a millimeter long, and they get spread around by the currents. And it's those larvae that provide connections for those animals that are, as adults, attached to the seabed. So the connection can happen either through the animal moving itself or through the larvae moving. And so what are some of those movements? Well, the biggest movement of all is the Great Migration. And these are the vertical migration of animals through the water that that happens every day. So we know that, for example, sperm whales will dive deep from the surface and will dive up to over 1,000, 2,000 meters to find food to eat. Typically they eat squid, for example, and they will do this during the day. And then they come back up to the surface after a few hours to breathe. But we also know that there's all these other animals that live at depth, small shrimp, for example, small fish, that live at depth in the daytime because they don't want to be seen. And they come up to the surface at twilight, usually at dusk, to the surface to where their own food is, they feed, and then at dawn, they move back to the greater depths, again, avoiding being eaten. And this is the greatest movement of animals that happens on our planet on a daily basis. And so it is pretty certain that this movement is actually going to be affected by climate change because who lives at the surface, what the food is going to be is going to change, how much of that food is going to be at the surface is going to change, and therefore how far animals will come to the surface to feed, when will they do this, and which animals will remain at depth that can be supported by the changing environment at the surface. All this is expected to change. So the individual actors, players are going to change, and also the rates at which these animals are moving up and down are expected to change. Another aspect of transfer of, in this case, of material, of carbon, and we all hear about carbon sequestration into the deep, that is related to animals is by moving up and down, and these animals feeding at different depths and where they poop, for example, can affect carbon transfer. So for example, again, we see here whales that go to depth 2 kilometers to feed, and then they remove carbon from that depth and they bring it up to the surface because they swim back up to the surface, and that is where they poop. So then all of a sudden the carbon has been transformed and has moved from the depth to the surface. But the same token, if a whale at the surface is swimming and then dies because they get old and they die, or because they get hit by a ship, whatever happens, when they sink, all that carbon that is trapped in a massive whale will sink to the seabed, and they will actually be responsible for creating an entire ecosystem that is particular to breaking down the carbon of that whale. And so there's a lot of that transfer of carbon that happens by being trapped in animals that feed in one place, die in a different place, or migrate across different locations. And so, for example, again, we expect this to change with climate change as we hear that migratory pathways, for example, are going to change with climate change. If the water becomes too warm, a sea turtle may not be interested in, it may be deleterious for them to migrate through a particular area, and that migratory pathway may change. And so by changing that pathway, we're also changing how that carbon is going to get transported from the surface layers to the deep. We know, for example, that there has been a massive change in the amount of carbon that hits the deep seabed after whaling, because whales were severely depleted, their migratory pathways changed, and so where they died also changed, and how many of them died also changed, and how much carbon hit the seabed also changed. And we expect similar changes to happen with climate change. Now, there's another aspect of connectivity that has to do with dispersal of larvae, as I said, but here's a study that actually tried to look at specifically how currents connect areas in the locations in the ABNJ with coastal zones of least developed countries. And what you see in this figure here is in different colors, is you see the strength of those connections. And so in deep red, in this very deep red that you see here in the Indian Ocean, for example, that deep red corresponds to 4,000 kilometers. What this means is what happens in that area where you see that red, that deep red, impacts 4,000 kilometers of coastline. And so you can see a similar thing going on in the Pacific, in the Central Pacific, and on both sides there. And so what this indicates is that whatever happens in the high seas doesn't just stay in the high seas, it will impact what happens to the coasts. And so, for example, if we think of a major ecosystem change, a major pollution event that happens offshore, you can expect that impact is going to be felt across a large range of coastline throughout the world. So to be thinking of those things as separate, what happens in national waters versus what happens in the ABNJ, are two separate issues. They're not, they're really connected. And so here's an example of a study that looked at larval connections specifically, and these are larvae of animals that live at hydrothermal vents. Just to orient you, this in the Pacific, here's Manus, based in Solomon Islands, North Fiji. And so what you see here are predictions that were made about how larval transport of these animals that live attached to the seabed typically will change by the end of the century under the RCP 8.8 scenario. And what you see in red are connections that are going to be made, new connections, and what you see in blue are connections that are going to be lost. And so you may think that new connections are great, except if we think about alien species, we don't want to be able to increase the connections of alien species, invasive species across places, but that can change as well. We may have more connections than we'd really like to see. But importantly, what we also see here is a lot of loss of connections. And here in this inset, you can see in white illustrated those lost connections. And what this means is that if you have an area in the Kermadec where the population relies on animals from Lao Tonga area to come in and colonize to sustain those populations, that is not going to happen. But if we keep, our way to the climate change scenarios by the end of the century, those connections will be lost, which means that certain areas will be placed at risk. Those populations may not be replenishable. We may lose it forever. And so what I want to leave you with is this idea that really, when we think about the ocean, we really should be thinking about connections. It is all about connections. We know that the global ocean is connected all the way from the surface to the abyss and horizontally, but we also know that it's connected vertically, but we also know it's connected horizontally. We know that these connections can be food, it can be involve nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and also larval dispersal. So those are some of the examples of connections. But we do know that whatever the connections are, they do support the health of our planet. So when we're thinking about spatial protection and this new BBNJ agreement, we really should be thinking about protecting and managing those connections very importantly. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. I think you've presented us with some critical information about, one, how we are connected to one another, as well as how we're connected to the ocean, and how we need to start incorporating these connections as well as change into our planning and conservation and management tools. That was, I realized you were going to have to leave us to go to a, you're okay to the end? Great. Okay, then we will go directly to Meinhard Duella, and I'm hoping people will start to collect their questions for our speakers, because we are trying to preserve that 20 minutes at the end. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Anna, for that wonderful introduction. And I think it does a wonderful job of introducing the governance challenge, right? And key elements of that governance challenge are the connectivity that Anna's talked about, the uncertainties, and the change that we can expect. So let me just introduce a couple of concepts before I get into the focus of my talk, which is strategic assessments. So the first comment I want to make is that, of course, strategic assessments are one among a number of ocean governance tools, right? So and I've tried to organize them in this chart, in this slide, from highest to lowest tier. So at the kind of at the highest level, you have integrated planning at from a global to a regional perspective. You then have the, potentially regional assessments, environmental assessments, or more broadly, regional assessments, and then strategic assessments. You have area-based management, which are included in the BBNJ text. You have things like recovery plans for endangered species. You have project assessments, again, included in the BBNJ regime. And then you have a variety of regulatory processes, right? So on the high seas, that would include the IMO, it would include the International Seabed Authority, and so on. And then you have a variety of non-regulatory governance tools, right? And ideally, these tiers of governance tools would work together to deal with the connectivity that Anna's identified and the uncertainty and the change that is associated with all of that, right? So, so that's kind of a high-level overview. I then want to talk for a couple minutes just about the role of impact assessment generally. And so, the BBNJ regime includes project-level impact assessment as well as strategic assessments. And so when you look at the literature on environmental assessment, very quickly you see that over the last 20 years, it's become clear that the focus on project level assessments is not enough. And yes, project level assessments are important, but increasingly the focus has shifted to strategic assessments and regional assessments. And sometimes regional assessments are considered to be part of strategic assessment. Sometimes they're separated, but that's the kind of, these three tiers are increasingly recognized to be critical for effective impact assessment. So it's nice to see that we have strategic assessments included in the BBNJ text. Yeah, so, but there are a couple other things that I think are also worth highlighting. The importance of cooperative joint assessment. So this brings in, again, related to the connectivity issue, that brings in the importance of cooperation between the BBNJ regime and other players in ocean governance, and that those can be coastal states, but they can also be other regimes on the high seas, like the IMO and the International Seabed Authority. And so there are a number of others that I won't go through. Cumulative effects, of course, is a critical one that's important to highlight. And ultimately, you want a process that is effective, efficient, and fair. So let's then turn to the strategic EA, or the SEA element in the BBNJ regime. So what are some of the things that we should be looking for from that? What are some of the things that the SEA process can contribute to the challenges of connectivity, uncertainty, and change? Well, first of all, good SEA needs to be able to be customized to fit the particular application, because SEAs can be applied in many different contexts. And I think part of the challenge with the current text is that we're thinking about the role of SEA way too narrowly, right? So yes, it can be applied kind of retroactively when a party is proposing a policy plan or program that affects the high seas. That is an acceptable and a good application of SEA, but SEAs can also be applied to a region to more broadly assess all human activities and all ecosystem functions that are provided in that region. It can work on a sector by sector basis. So when a new type of activity is considered, you can do a strategic assessment, to consider whether it's warranted. So fishing the mesopelagic or introducing aquaculture and so on and so on. So many sectors, new sectors can be assessed through a strategic assessment. And there are many other issues that you could do a strategic assessment on. The ultimate goal is to inform and improve decision-making. And that decision-making can be decision-making at the project level, but there are opportunities to improve decision-making all through the governance tiers that I identified. Good SEA should be driven by sustainability principles. Perhaps the SDGs are a good starting point for that. And they should integrate an analysis of social, biophysical, and economic impacts. They should be integrated with higher and lower tiers, so should be integrated with regional and project level assessments. They should be transparent, and there should be a mutual learning experience for everyone involved. So if that's what we're looking for in an SEA process under the BBNJ negotiations, what needs to change? What further improvements do we need to make to the BBNJ text? So first of all, I think SEA still needs to be defined more broadly and to more clearly include regional assessments, but also to future-proof SEA to ensure that it can adapt to serve other needs beyond those three that are identified in one of the current definitions. I think we need to be clear in the text that SEA can help make the link between global governance, regional governance, and local governance, and that it can help make the link between the governance of the high seas and coastal governance. And again, I think Anna's presentation very eloquently identifies the importance of doing that. It can be a mechanism for encouraging cooperation with other decision makers. And that those are decision makers in areas beyond national jurisdiction, but also decision makers outside of areas beyond national jurisdictions that will affect the high seas. So the IMO, International Seabed Authorities, regional fisheries management organizations, coastal states, and flag states. So integration with existing planning and assessment processes, and in particular, and I think we'll talk more about this, area-based management, right? So there are important links between strategic assessments and area-based management. I think we need to ensure that SEAs are sufficiently independent, and so the effort on internationalization of environmental impact assessment at the project level should be extended to strategic assessments. What that means will depend on the issue, but the basic idea is that the process needs to be sufficiently impartial and independent to be credible and to lead to sound outcomes. And of course, you need the time, resources to make this work. I'll just skip to my last slide. What are some of the specific shortcomings in the current text that I think we need to work on? First one, again, picking up on my previous slide, strategic assessment should still be defined more broadly. The links between strategic assessment and area-based management, including marine protected areas, should be more clearly established, including the possibility of doing strategic assessment to identify areas that should be protected or that should be managed using these tools. The role of strategic assessments in encouraging better cooperation between the BBNJ and other decision makers, consideration of higher and lower governance tiers. So, thinking about how SEA will connect to these other governance tools, thinking about this from a global, regional, and local perspective. And then lastly, I think we need SEAs to be, in addition to being initiated by parties, individual parties and groups of parties, which is what the current text suggests, they should also be an opportunity to initiate them by the COP, by the regime as a whole. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Meinhard. That is truly an invaluable overview of what we are dealing with. A new sea, that was the uncertainties as well as the change and connectivity. And I think it really helps to lay out how the strategic environmental assessments can be that tool to actually engage a multiple range of stakeholders in that learning process, because it doesn't look like one time around is really going to be enough. We have to continue to update that knowledge if we're going to keep pace with the level of change. So thank you so much. I think now we're going to segue over to Simi Payne, who's going to take us into an even deeper dive into the further revised draft text that the President shared on May 30th. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you, Meinhard and Anna. It was so interesting to hear what you're talking about. Now, as Christina said, I'm going to take us into the text because that's where this is really all going to become reality. It has to go through these little black and white letters to get us back to that incredible ocean that Anna was showing us. So to achieve the objectives of the BBNJ agreement, the conservation of high seas biodiversity and its use only if the use is sustainable, the text has to be drafted to take account of those real conditions in the physically and biologically connected ocean that Dr. Metaxas has shown us, with the overlay of climate change impacts and the recognition that this is a very dynamic, changing ocean. Over the 100 years or more that we expect this agreement will guide us and help us, we need to make it what we keep calling future-proof. Okay, so the need for the BBNJ agreement was the recognition that while damaging fishing practices and other activities can be addressed by effective laws and enforcement, there's another element, the climate change impacts or the greenhouse gas pollution that Earth is committed to, are stressors that cannot be halted. We're already committed to them. So reducing other stressors is the only intervention that can help ocean life adapt and survive. That's what our ABMT, area-based management tools in marine protected areas, and environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment are going to achieve. When we meet in August, we will have the mandate to translate these objectives into treaty text. So I'm going to focus on some text elements that should reflect these lessons that we've just learned. And in general, I'm going to follow the order of the text within each section. So I'll mix up climate change and connectivity a little bit. I'm going to go fairly quickly through the text. So you may actually want to take out a pencil and paper just to jot down the articles that I'll mention or highlight them in your copy of the new draft text as being especially relevant to connectivity and climate change. So there's the two components of environmental assessment in the BBNJ text. You've been introduced to the key elements of strategic environmental assessment by Professor Doel, the increasingly common process for looking at the big picture. And that has a close relationship to our ability to take account of cumulative impacts. First, let's look at two important general articles, the use of terms and general principles, and then at EIA, and then at area-based management tools and MPA. So use of terms is critical. Yes?
Never mind, you're there.
Okay. So Article 1, use of terms, is a critical part. Lawyers listening will know why I'm saying this. These definitions will affect the entire agreement. If cumulative impacts is defined narrowly, it doesn't matter what other agreements say, that will be the application for this agreement. So important to focus on this. Now, Article 1, subparagraph 8 offers two options for cumulative impacts. And just move this they have generally the same scope. It's important to make sure that as the text gets discussed, that scope remains very broad and encompassing, particularly to include climate change impacts, but also this is another way of dealing with the connectivity issues as we look fairly broadly. I want to pause for a moment here and focus on the fact that there's been a lot of concern expressed about the seemingly overwhelming task of looking at cumulative impacts. This is something, cumulative impact analysis is a developing process, but we have experience doing it over many years. And there is a lot of information that's available out there. So it shouldn't be too daunting, but it's important to see it as an evolving process that we need to provide for. The next general topic that I wanted to mention is Article 5, General Principles and Approaches. I should say also that Meinhardt mentioned the SEA definition. I'm not focusing on it here, but that Article 1 definition of SEA is a critical element also. So Article 5, General Principles and Approaches. This is an important element to set the guidance that this treaty is going to take an approach that builds ecosystem resilience to adverse impacts of climate change and ocean acidification and restores ecosystem integrity. So we want to make sure that we see that in we keep this term and build on it. When we look at the environmental impact assessment section, we want to remember that environmental impact assessment was initially about looking at a particular activity in its narrow context. And that was novel when the US environmental assessment law was signed into law on January 1st of 1970, a long time ago. The first big insight was we have to consider the environmental impacts of this activity, which we are doing for some other purpose. Maybe it's a road or something. No one thought about the environment before this as being relevant to road design. So the second important effect of environmental impact assessment practice and laws that are now so widespread globally is that a business or government that has to consider before it acts and that has to disclose what it learns to the public is likely to act differently than it would absent public disclosure. Since then, after 50 years of practice of EIA, the world has changed and the practice of EIA has changed so that we understand that it's much more dynamic and it's much more connected. Yes, EIA is a process, but we have to look at and undertake that process in terms of connectivity. And that's just one dimension of a modern EIA that we're talking about today. So when we look at what UNCLOS provides from the early, really developed in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, we have to bear in mind that that was a snapshot in time. We need to think about how we look at these issues today in light of the science. So both cumulative impacts and providing for strategic environmental assessments are provided for in the environmental impact assessment objectives in Article 21 bis. So that's an important element to keep in mind. In Article 22, subparagraph 3, the requirement, this is one of the most crucial pieces of the EIA section. And it's the question of whether EIA applies just to activities conducted in areas beyond national jurisdiction or to all activities that have an impact in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So it's the location versus impacts. Clearly, thinking about the connectivity between national, coastal, if you want to think of it that way, and open ocean regions that you've learned about this morning, today. Sorry, I'm in the East Coast, so it's morning. It's clear that activities that take place within national jurisdiction that have an impact in ABNJ need to be included. They need to be considered. And again, it makes it slightly more complex, but it's not an insurmountable difficulty. It's something that we can and already do. Governments, including the United States, already take activities, the impact of activities within their national waters on areas beyond their national waters into account in environmental assessment. The thresholds section, Article 24, is quite complex. Important to note that it does mention cumulative effects. And so just we want to make sure that that stays in as a critical part. And again, remember that this is tied back to the Article 1 definition of terms. There's a certain overlap between Article 24 and Article 25. So Article 25 is devoted to cumulative impacts and transboundary impacts. As the negotiation goes forward, we need to think about, does it make more sense to have that as a separate article? Strategic, this is the strategic environmental assessment article. And so please bear in mind what Meinhard has told us about what needs to be considered there. So I'm going to turn to the area-based management tools section. This is connectivity is especially relevant to this section, but the concept of planning protective measures for biodiverse and vulnerable ecosystems while bearing in mind the physical and biological linkages between regions, depths, and timeframes is not explicit in this section. What we do have is a reference to, in Article 14, the objectives of the area-based management tools, a reference to creating a system of area-based management tools and marine protected areas requiring protection. That is going to be critical. And you can see now if you think about the need to have these connected areas, for example, for the larval connections that Dr. Metaxas showed us, and you think about how can you plan that, think about how SEA, as explained by Dr. Doel, will give us the tool to do that. Hopefully this starts tying those sections together, and you can see the importance of inclusion of these elements. So the system of ABMTs and the network of marine protected areas. The text in bold below, the top text is what's in the new draft. Below is some language that IUCN has proposed that emphasizes also the unclose concepts of protection and maintenance of ecosystems. So we invite you to consider that. Also, potentially a more explicit reference to adaptive management, thinking about over time the kind of dynamism and change that we're likely to see is going to be important. There's a question about whether there should be a separate annex for providing indicative criteria for identification of areas to be addressed by area-based management tools in marine protected areas. Annex 1 actually is the source of the explicit reference to ecological connectivity as a criterion for applying these tools. And it also refers to cumulative and transboundary impacts. Alternatively, the text could, rather than defining specific criteria here, it could reference other instruments and guidelines, such as the IUCN guidelines. So in conclusion, the text could be more explicit about connectivity. There will be places in the text, which I hope I've shown you some suggestions of today, that will be not so explicit, but will lead to addressing the issues that we've talked about so far. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Simi. That is a wonderful overview and deep dive into the current draft text. We've gotten quite a few great questions, and it's difficult to know where to begin, but I'm going to begin with those that talk about, from Dominique Virgil to a petal, that was how to ensure that the EIAs and SEA procedures under the BBNJ agreement will actually not overlap and not put too much burden on developing states. How can we actually try to include that into the processes? Simi, Meinhard, and Anna, maybe you'd like to take a quick stab at that. Anna, shall we start with you?
Sure. I don't really know that is my expertise to think about how we can do this because I'm not a governance person, but I can think about it in terms of practically. There was another question that's sort of kind of linked to this, which is how much connectivity is enough connectivity? And I think that may actually, lead to the answer. Then how do we link, how do we reduce that burden? Who determines how much? And that is not a simple question. And I'm not sure that this is something that we can just sort of, again, because, for example, we think about coastal states, we think about developing states, and then we think that the area, the high seas, and the connections are so vast that occur at so many different levels that it's hard to think how you're going to separate them. I would say that considering we're starting from the high seas, the ABNJ, I think, there should be some general guidelines that can be produced, rules of thumb, if you wish, which is actually what is also currently being used by a lot of member states, cheap ways to look at connectivity, cheap both in terms of capacity, knowledge, technology, etc. So we can start simple and then worry about how complex we're going to get in terms of answering the question of what is it connected and how much do we need. And I think that maybe if we start simple, then we may be able to reduce the burden on, the multiple stakeholders that are involved, rights holders that are involved in the process.
That's super. I think, yeah, we can also start to rely on the maps that oceanographers produce of currents. That was in eddies and gyres, and start to identify those connections pretty early on and start to identify some priority places. Meinhard, you have your,
Yeah. So just a couple of quick comments. So I think capacity building is a key part of this, right? And there's a separate section in the treaty that deals with that. But also joint assessments, I think, are also a big part of the solution, right? Like we should not be putting this burden on any one party, let alone a developing country, to carry out the assessments, whether they be project level assessments or strategic assessments. So we should be focusing on joint assessments. And the last point I'll make is I think the efforts by a number of countries to internationalize the process, the impact assessment process, which should include strategic assessments, I think also will help with that, because it will give more of an opportunity for the institutions that are being created under the regime to support the efforts of parties to implement the impact assessment part.
that was that idea of joint assessments, because most of these ecosystems are really too large for any one nation to try to undertake. But if you could bring in the expertise from the other side of the globe, as well as the regional expertise, you could build lots of, hopefully, local capacity. Simi, please.
I think the global scientific enterprise is also a good model for this. We start with what we know and what we can know. We build on that. And international cooperation has allowed ocean research to go forward in a way that would not be possible if each country was siloed off and responsible for their own activities. So we need to think of this as a long-term building process, and one that international cooperation is key to, just as both Anna and Meinhard described.
Anna, please jump right in.
Yeah, I would like to respond to Simi. Well, I think that's great, but what has happened I mean, it sounds very idealistic in a way, but the reality is that the international scientific community is very much based on, the global north, Western science. And so I agree with you that that is a model that we can consider, but we have to revise it before we actually use it as a model, right? We have to revise it so it's much more inclusive, equitable. It's all those things that it currently really is not. And so we need to be a little cautious about it if we use it as an ideal,
It fits very well with the goals of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, with its emphasis on co-design, co-participation, and you're really trying to equalize that access to knowledge, tools, and technologies for understanding the marine environment. But we haven't seen any actual projects coming out that could help. Meinhard, who has the obligation to conduct an strategic environmental assessment, and what should the trigger be?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is, when you're reacting to a party's policy plan or program, I think it is fair to put the obligation on that party to carry out the strategic assessment of that policy plan or program. But I think what we're talking about here is much broader, right? And so the question of how do you trigger a strategic assessment to deal with some of the broader issues that we're talking about is a complicated question. And I think the answer to me is that we should be initiating those in cooperation with partners, in cooperation with coastal states, in cooperation with institutions that are also making important decisions that are relevant. So if you picture, for example, doing a regional assessment in an area, then you make I think the ideal scenario would be is that the COP of the BBNJ regime would make the call that a regional assessment in that area is warranted in light of the conditions being suitable to work to making progress, right? So I would I would focus less on who has the responsibility to trigger and focus more on where's the opportunity to bring the partners, the decision makers, the key players together to make progress on how we effectively manage a particular region within the global context.
That's quite exciting. I see one question about how could SEAs promote cross-sectoral cooperation. There's talk in the BBNJ agreement about actually an ad hoc working group that would be developed. Can you think of that or another mechanism to actually start to bring together sectors and stakeholders in this endeavor?
Yeah, so my impression is, and I'll defer to Simi on this, but my impression is that kind of cross-sectoral cooperation is not easy to achieve at the moment. So I actually would view strategic assessments as an opportunity to build the trust and relationships between the players so that you then through that process get to a point where you might establish some of these more permanent mechanisms for cooperation. But I think and this is also one of the reasons why I'm not advocating for kind of you must do this, but rather looking for opportunities to bring together players in a particular region to build the trust and relationships between the actors and the sectors that currently may not be there.
Simi, do you want to jump in, or do you want to ask a more specific question on if the BBNJ agreement were to include the impacts of activities within national jurisdiction on areas beyond national jurisdiction? How do we start to recognize the sovereignty of nations, but also their obligations vis-a-vis the international community?
I think part of what people have in mind there is that something like plastics, okay, we know it's a huge ocean pollution problem. It's mainly terrestrial. It's not entirely because a lot of it's fishing gear, but it's significantly a terrestrial problem. So does that mean that, New Jersey's single-use plastic shopping bag law is somehow related to BBNJ? I think the answer to that is a practical one. As we practice environmental impact assessment globally, almost every country does, we don't look at every single little activity and do an environmental impact assessment on it. There is a kind of screen that we use when we're scoping. And I think we need to be practical about this. There's not a lot of projects that are going to be taking place on land. We're not going to revisit the entire economy of every country simply by saying that we need an effects-based EIA standard.
Thanks. You've also referred to some of the other obligations under the law of the Sea Convention, not to cause pollution in areas beyond national jurisdiction, obligations to monitor and assess your own activities. And I think also the obligation under UNCLOS to actually help other nations conduct environmental assessments has not been considered enough in our processes. But I realize we're running out of time, and I've probably spoken too much. I'd love to give, starting with Anna, a chance to think, give us a 50-second key takeaway that you would like to leave this audience with. Though I know we could talk all day.
So yeah, I think I would like to stress again and again the importance of the global ocean, of protecting the connections that occur on multiple levels, but also I also want to stress the fact that it doesn't have to be complicated to start with. And so though it sounds like it's something really complex and therefore we all throw our arms up and say, well, we can't do it, it's too complicated. There are ways to do it simply, at least for start, and then we can take it from there.
Cool. Minor.
Yeah, so I think the key is to try to come to grips with what should be dealt with at a global level, what do you do at a regional level, and what do you do at a local level. And I think if we do that, and particularly if we do good regional assessments, then I think it does simplify things. So for example, the regional assessment can allow you to figure out what the main impacts on a region is from outside the region, right? So it allows you to set priorities and so on. So I think if we do that and ensure that the tools are there to be used, then I think we do have a good starting point for managing the high seas.
Excellent. Okay, protect those connections simply. Simi.
I'd like to ask you, when you're proposing text, whether you're a negotiator or someone who is hoping to influence or provide ideas to negotiators, that you'll keep in mind Dr. Metaxas's presentation, the ideas, the world that she created in your mind, because that is the real ocean. And that is what we have to deal with. We have to make sure that every part of the text, from the definitions of terms to the authorities of the treaty bodies to the specific subject matter elements, all go to that same purpose of conserving and only being sustainable in our use of the ocean that we've just seen described. And if you do that, I will thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Well, thank you. And I will thank the panelists from the bottom of my heart, and also to those who have stayed with us this long and those who will listen hereafter. That was, I think we have really learned so much. And I think, that the key takeaways is it doesn't have to be complicated, but we can start really at the regional level, but we need those global level mandates to help encourage that type of cross-sectoral cooperation that will be required to address the horizontal, vertical, and time dimension of change in our marine environment. So thank you so much. Together we can deal with the uncertainties, connectivity, and climate change, but only if we do so together and as a whole. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday for more on marine genetic resources and scientific issues related thereto. Please join us. Thank you again. Take care. Bye-bye.